There is a moment in Elden Ring that most players experience without fully understanding what they are looking at. They enter a shallow underground lake, deep beneath the Ainsel River, where the water is red and the air carries the specific quality of something that should not be breathed. The Lake of Rot, a vast subterranean body of corrupted water, with ancient ruins half submerged beneath its surface and the specific atmosphere of a place that has been this way for a very long time. Beneath the Lake of Rot, sealed in the deepest part of the underground, is the divine essence of the outer god of Rot. This is where Malenia's story begins. Not with her birth, not with her curse, with the ancient entity that was imprisoned long before she existed, whose specific nature would shape everything that came after. The outer god of Rot. The Lands Between is a world where the gods are real in the specific functional sense. Their influence produces tangible effects. Their power can be channeled through worship and devotion. Their nature shapes the beings who come into contact with them. The Greater Will is the most powerful of the entities that have shaped the Lands Between. The cosmic force whose authority the Elden Ring mediates and whose will the two fingers interpret. But the Greater Will is not alone. The outer gods are other entities, beings of comparable divine weight, each with their own specific nature and their own specific portfolio, each capable of claiming mortal vessels through whom their influence enters the material world. The Formless Mother, whose domain is blood, the god of Scarlet Rot, whose domain is the cycle of decay and rebirth. The god of Scarlet Rot does not produce simple disease. The Scarlet Rot, contrary to the conventional notion of sickness, is the divine essence of an outer god, a force of nature that seeks to impose a specific cycle, decay and then rebirth, the rotting of existing things as the precondition for the emergence of new things. Not simply destruction, transformation through dissolution. Caelid, after Malenia's bloom, shows this cycle in progress. The land that was green and inhabited and alive has been transformed, not into nothing, but into something else. The specific creatures that inhabit blighted Caelid were not there before the Rot. They are the Rot's expression of what a world looks like when the outer god of Rot has claimed it. Flora and fauna, shaped by the Rot's specific logic, organized around the cycle the god seeks to establish. This is not death. It is the outer god's version of life. The blind swordsman, long before Malenia was born, long before the Shattering, long before even the Golden Order in its current form, the outer god of Rot had a presence in the Lands Between that someone found necessary to contain. The blind swordsman, a figure who exists only in legend, a hero of an earlier age, whose specific capabilities made him the instrument through which the Rot was sealed. He received a curved sword from a being called the Blue Dancer, a fairy figure whose relationship to water and the underground rivers of Silfra and Ainsel is suggested by the item descriptions that document her. The flowing quality of the sword, water as the specific counterforce to Rot's dissolution, was the mechanism of the sealing. He used it. He sealed the outer god of Rot in the deep underground beneath the Ainsel River, in the place that is now the Lake of Rot. The seal held. The god's active influence in the material world was contained. What the seal preserved, the god's divine essence, present in the underground, radiating outward through the water that had been transformed into the Lake of Rot. Not inert, simply contained. The specific distinction between a god sealed and a god destroyed matters in the Lands Between's logic. The outer god of Rot was not eliminated by the blind swordsman's work. It was imprisoned. What it could do from imprisonment was limited. But a prison is not an absence. The rot still existed in the world. The seal prevented the god's full expression. It could not prevent every expression. What radiates from a sealed god? The Lake of Rot is not simply an aesthetic choice. The underground lake exists as the immediate physical consequence of an imprisoned divine entity's presence. The specific corruption that radiates from something divine that cannot fully express itself in the material world. The water is not diseased in the conventional medical sense. It carries the rot's divine nature in diluted form, the specific overflow of a contained power that cannot help touching everything around it. From the Lake of Rot, the influence spreads through the underground in ways the seal cannot entirely prevent. The Ainsel River system, which connects the underground to the surface world in specific ways, carries traces of this influence toward the material world. Not enough to produce another Caelid. The seal contains the worst of it, but enough that the specific presence of the outer god of Rot in the lands between has never been zero, even during the centuries when the god appeared to be fully imprisoned, and then Miquella and Radahn produced children. The curse of the twin prodigies, Malenia and Miquella. The twin prodigies, born of a divine parentage that should have been impossible. Miquella and Radahn are the same being, expressed in different forms, and their children carry the specific contradiction of being born from a single divine source, split into two expressions. This parentage granted both of them Empyrean status, the designation that marked them as potential replacements for Miquella as the god of a new age. It also gave them their curses. The Empyrean, who carries too much divine potential, too much raw power for their mortal frame, is a vessel waiting to be claimed. The outer gods understand this. They reach toward beings whose specific qualities match their needs, whose nature can serve as the expression in the material world that an outer god requires. Miquella was claimed by eternal youth, frozen in a child's body, incapable of aging beyond a certain point, his Empyrean nature expressed in the specific stunted form that his curse imposed. Malenia was claimed by the outer god of Rot, not completely, not all at once. From birth, the Rot festered within her, a constant internal presence, the divine essence of a sealed god finding expression in the body of a being whose Empyrean status made her more accessible to divine influence than ordinary mortals. The Rot claimed her eyes. It claimed her limbs, which were replaced with prosthetics of copper and gold. It spread across her body in the visible patterns that anyone who fights her can see. The specific reddish corruption mapped across the skin of a being who has spent her entire life fighting something that has been inside her since the day she was born. She never fully gave in. This is what the law insists on. Across every item description and NPC dialogue that discusses her, Malenia resisted. Her will, her pride, her sense of self, along with the help of her brother Miquella's unalloyed gold needle. All of these were what she used to hold the Rot at bay. Not to cure it. She knew there was no cure. To refuse to become only what it wanted her to become. The needle was important. Miquella crafted it from unalloyed gold. The specific form of the divine metal that resisted outer god's influence rather than serving it. Pressed into her body, it disrupted the outer god's claim on her, reducing the Rot's ability to take over, giving her the specific space in which to be herself, rather than simply the Rot's instrument. She carried it, She used it, and she built around its protection the most extraordinary martial tradition the lands between had ever seen. The Clean Rot Knights, Malenia trained. This is the specific fact about her that distinguishes her from every other being in the lands between who carries a divine curse. She responded to her condition not by hiding or withdrawing, but by developing, to an extent that no other being achieved, the specific martial art of someone who has spent their entire life fighting the thing inside themselves. The waterfowl dance. The combination of movements that she developed over a lifetime of fighting with prosthetic limbs, with rotting eyes, with a body that has constantly been contested by something that wanted it for its own purposes. The specific quality of fluid, continuous motion, movements that flow into each other without pause, that offer no moment of stillness that an opponent could use, is not simply a combat style. It is the specific expression of someone who learned to move in ways that the Rot could not anticipate, because the Rot's logic was dissolution rather than the continuous flow she perfected. She assembled an army worthy of her name. The Clean Rot Knights, warriors who devoted themselves to her service, who adopted the specific name that acknowledged both what she carried and what she refused to become. Clean Rot, the paradox that was her existence, made into a military tradition. They wore her colors. They fought with her methods. They won battles that should have been unwinnable. The lore notes that Godric the Grafted, the demigod who assembled himself from the grafted limbs of others, who was powerful enough that his great rune was worth pursuing, grovelled at Malenia's feet for mercy after insulting her and suffering defeat. The greatest warrior in the lands between crushed the grafted king so completely that he begged. She has never known defeat. This is what she says, and it is true in the specific way that the most devastating moments of Malenia's story are true, technically accurate and also incomplete. The outer god waits. The outer god of Rot is not impatient. Gods of this nature do not have the specific relationship to time that mortals do. The wait from the blind swordsman's ceiling to Malenia's birth was not experienced as a wait in any conventional sense. The god had its vessel, the specific patience of something divine, expressed through the specific pressure it maintained on the consciousness of a being who resisted it every day of her life. The Rot inside Malenia was always building towards something. The Scarlet Aeonia, the bloom that would express the outer god's full presence through its vessel, required a specific condition to manifest. Malenia would have to abandon the pride and the will that had always kept it contained. She would have to, in the specific moment when the bloom became necessary, let go of what she had spent her life holding. She would do this once willingly in Caelid, at the Battle of Aeonia. The consequences would reshape a region of the lands between permanently and end the Shattering's most devastating conflict in the most devastating way possible. But before Caelid, there was the Shattering, and before the Shattering, there was the moment when the Elden ring broke. Sleep well. 7 more parts remain, and the Rot is patient. The Elden ring shattered. Marika broke it, the act that the game's opening narration names as the beginning of everything that follows, the specific catastrophe that sent the lands between into the Shattering's wars. Marika was imprisoned inside the Erdtree for this. Radahn imprisoned with her, attempted to repair the ring from within and failed, and the fragments, the great runes, the shards of divine authority that the unbroken ring had contained, scattered into the hands of Marika's children. Each demigod became a shard-bearer. Each shard-bearer had a fragment of what had once been the governing principle of the lands between, and each demigod, looking at what they now carried, and looking at the empty throne that the ring's breaking had left, began to move. Why Malenia marched. Malenia and Miquella both claimed shards. They were shard-bearers, as their siblings were. But Malenia was not marching south to claim the Elden Ring's reconstitution for herself. The law is consistent on this. She had no interest in becoming Elden Lord. The Shard-Bearer Wars, for most of her siblings, were about the throne. For Malenia, the march had a different purpose. She was fighting for Miquella. The DLC's revelations about Miquella's plan. The vow between Miquella and Radahn. The plan for Miquella to ascend to godhood with Radahn as his consort. The specific sequence of events that required Radahn to die so his soul could be brought to the land of shadow. These were in motion before the Battle of Aeonia. Malenia's march south was not simply responding to shattering politics. She was fulfilling the role of Miquella's blade in the most literal sense of her title. She was going to kill Radahn for Miquella. The southward march. Malenia led her clean rot knights from the Haligtree. Southward along the Bellum Highway, the specific route that Sword Monuments document across the lands between, through Liurnia of the Lakes, through Limgrave, toward Caelid, where Radahn had established his stronghold at Redmane Castle and had been conducting his own wars against the other demigods. The Clean Rot Knights had been undefeated. This is what the Shattering's records emphasize. Not simply that they were powerful, but that through the entire Shattering's carnage, through every battle Malenia chose to fight on the march south, they had never lost. An undefeated army led by an undefeated commander, cutting through the Shattering's chaos with the specific precision of warriors who had been built around a single guiding principle: protect the blade of Miquella and follow where she goes. They fought Godric first. Godric the Grafted, the demigod who assembled himself from the limbs of others, who was powerful enough that his great rune was significant and whose Stormvale Castle was a genuine fortress. He insulted Malenia. He suffered for it. He grovelled at her feet for mercy after she had finished with him, in the specific humiliation that the law preserves as testimony to what Malenia's capability actually was. They moved on toward Caelid. Radahn, the man she was going to kill. Starscourge Radahn. General Radahn, the Red Lion of Caelid, feared as the strongest demigod during the Shattering, the son of Radahn and Rennala, which made him Malenia's half-sibling, the child of their shared father and Rennala of Raya Lucaria, raised in a different tradition with a different lineage from the twin prodigies. He was extraordinary in ways that did not overlap with Malenia's extraordinariness, where she was precision and flow, and the specific mastery of someone who had made her limitations into the foundation of an art form. He was scale and force, and the specific quality of someone whose body had grown so large that ordinary cavalry was impossible. And so, he had learned gravitational magic in Celia, specifically, so that he could continue riding his childhood horse Leonard without crushing the animal. Leonard, the scrawny horse, that a demigod the size of a tower continued riding out of devotion, a detail that every player who has faced Radahn carries with them from the fight. He could not ride any other horse. He would not abandon this one. He learned magic to make it possible to keep what he loved. He had stopped the stars. Radahn had wielded his gravitational power with a completeness that no other warrior in the lands between possessed, and he had turned it toward an act of impossible scale. The stars over Caelid had been halted, frozen in place. The specific motions of celestial bodies that govern the specific fates of beings connected to them, including Ranni the Witch, whose own fate was tied to the stars and who could not move forward in her plan until they moved again, were held in place by Radahnn's gravity. Why he stopped them is debated. The evidence suggests he was protecting Celia from a meteor that his calculations predicted would destroy the town of sorcery where he had studied. One star, stopped by a demigod, who would not allow a place that had given him knowledge to be destroyed, and the other stars halted with it because gravitational magic at that scale is not surgical. He was holding the stars for decades. Wandering the wailing dunes in his madness after the battle with Malenia would retain this ability, because even his feral state, the gravitational power persisted in him, and the stars remained unmoved until someone killed him. The Battle of Aeonia. The Clean Rot Knights met the Redmane Knights on the field southwest of Celia, town of sorcery. The two armies fought. Both sides suffered catastrophic casualties. The armies reduced each other until what remained was the two demigods themselves, the only living thing still standing on a battlefield that had already consumed thousands. They were evenly matched. This is the specific quality of the Battle of Aeonia that makes it one of the most remarkable events in the Lands Between's history. Not that one of them was dominant, but that they found each other's exact equal. Malenia, the greatest warrior who had never been defeated, against Radahn, the strongest demigod of the Shattering. Neither could overcome the other. The stalemate lasted. The duel continued without resolution. Two beings of extraordinary capability unable to find the specific moment of advantage that would end it. Then Malenia made a choice. The needle broke. The unalloyed gold needle had been pressed into her body since Miquella made it. The specific protection that disrupted the outer god's claim on her, that gave her the space to be herself, rather than simply the Rot's instrument. It was what had allowed her to fight as herself, with her own will directing her power, for every battle she had ever won. During the Battle of Aeonia, the needle broke, or she broke it herself. The specific circumstances, whether the needle failed under the stress of combat, or whether Malenia made the deliberate decision to shatter it, knowing what the shattering would release, is one of the law's maintained ambiguities. What the needle breaking meant, the outer god's claim was no longer disrupted. Everything that had been held back by the specific property of unalloyed gold, the rot that had been building for decades inside a body that refused to be only the rot's instrument, was released simultaneously. Not gradually the way the rot normally progressed in her. All at once, the Scarlet Aeonia bloomed. What the bloom was. A flower of scarlet rot, enormous, rising from Malenia's body at the center of the battlefield. Not metaphorically, physically, a bloom of divine rot expressing itself through the vessel that had been carrying it since birth, finally unconstrained. The specific moment when her outer god, kept at bay for decades by an Empyrean's pride and a needle of unalloyed gold, was allowed to express what it had always been building toward. The blooms scattered Aeonian butterflies across the landscape, the same butterflies that are found throughout Caelid in the game, that are associated with the Rot's divine nature. It terraformed the battlefield, the field southwest of Celia, that had been ordinary, if bloodied ground, became the swamp of Aeonia, the festering bog of Scarlet Rot, that is one of the first landmarks the Tarnished encounters in Caelid. The petrified mark of the flower is still visible at the exact location where Malenia bloomed, in the center of the swamp. Radahn's great rune burned. The divine artifact that was his specific inheritance burned against the rot that the bloom had released. The great rune of Radahn, which resisted influence and protected the integrity of its bearer, fighting the Scarlet Rot with everything it could provide. It kept him alive. It could not keep him sane. The rot consumed his mind. Radahn wondered. The greatest demigod of the Shattering, who had stopped the stars and fought Malenia to a standstill, and ridden Leonard across the wailing dunes for decades, reduced to a feral creature, howling at the sky, consuming the flesh of friend and foe alike, retaining nothing of what he had been except the gravitational power that held the stars in place. The Redmane Knights, without their commander, burned the crests on their armor, the red lion symbol of Radahn's lineage, seared into the left breast of their armor as an act of resolve. They would stay. They would not go home. They would use fire to try to hold the rot at bay, to prevent it from consuming what remained of Caelid. They knew this was not a long-term solution. They stayed anyway. Malenia whispered before she bloomed. When the Scarlet Aeonia was released, in the specific moment before the bloom, with Radahn within reach, with what she was about to do already beginning, Malenia whispered something in his ear. The DLC revealed what she said. The young lion's armor item description preserves it. Miquella awaits thee, O promised consort. She knew about the vow. She knew that Radahn's death was the precondition for his soul reaching the land of shadow, for Miquella's plan to proceed, for the consort to be where the god needed him. She whispered this not as a comfort to the man she was killing, but as an acknowledgement of what his death meant, what it was for, what it was going to produce. She was Miquella's blade, in the most complete sense of that title. At the moment of the bloom, she was doing exactly what the blade does, serving the one who wields it. Radahn did not die at Aeonia, but his soul began, in the specific logic of Miquella's plan, to move toward its destination. The stars that he had held in place would eventually be freed. His death at the Tarnished's hands would complete what the battle had begun. The aftermath. Malenia fell into a coma. The bloom, releasing everything the needle had held back, cost her what she had. The outer god had expressed itself through her, and what remained afterward was a body of a demigod that had given everything it had in a single moment of divine expression. She lay in the swamp of Aeonia. The rot she had released surrounded her. The creatures that the rot spawned, the kindred of rot, the pests, swarmed the new swamp. She lay among them. They were, in some sense, her children, born from what she had released, shaped by the outer god that had always been inside her. She did not welcome them. The law is specific on this. Malenia would not embrace the creatures that the Scarlet Rot spawned. She had spent her entire life refusing to be only what the rot wanted her to be. Even after the bloom, even in the coma, even surrounded by the specific expressions of the outer god, whose claim she had finally, in one moment, honored. She was still Malenia, still the blade, still the warrior who had never known defeat. Clean Rot Knight Finlay found her. The description of the ashes associated with Finlay is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of writing in Elden Ring. She was one of the few survivors of the Battle of Aeonia, who in an unimaginable act of heroism carried the slumbering demigod Malenia all the way back to the Haligtree. She managed the feat alone, fending off all manner of foes along the way. One soldier, a Clean Rot knight whose entire army had been devastated in the battle, whose commander was unconscious, whose route back to the Haligtree ran through a Caelid, now transformed by the rot her commander had released. She carried Malenia alone. Through everything, she made it. Sleep well. 6 more parts remain, and Malenia still sleeps in the Haligtree. Malenia was carried back to the Haligtree. Radahn wandered the wailing dunes, feral, his mind consumed by the rot his great rune was keeping from consuming his body. And Caelid, the region where the Battle of Aeonia had been fought, where the bloom had transformed the battlefield into a swamp, continued to change. The Scarlet Rot does not simply destroy. This is what the law insists on, across every item, description and environmental detail in Caelid. It transforms. It replaces. The cycle of decay and rebirth that the outer god of rot represents is not simply metaphor. It is a functional process. What the rot touches dies in one sense and becomes in another. What Caelid became before the Battle of Aeonia. Caelid was a region of the lands between like any other, inhabited, imperfect, governed by Radahn, from Redmane Castle, home to the town of sorcery at Celia, where Radahn had studied gravitational magic as a young demigod. It had villages, it had people. It had the specific ordinary complexity of a place where life was happening. After the bloom, Caelid became the specific nightmare that every player who approaches it from Limgrave experiences. A region bathed in perpetual crimson haze, where the ground is stained red, where the creatures that inhabit it have been transformed by the rot into something that the original ecosystems did not contain. Crabs the size of houses, dogs with exposed skeletal structure whose biology has been reshaped by the rot's specific logic, the trees and vegetation replaced by the scarlet flora that the rot cultivates, the specific plants that grow wherever the outer god's influence has taken hold. The dragons that had lived in the dragon barrow fled, unable to resist the rot spread, abandoning their ancestral territory rather than be consumed. Some could not flee in time. Exix, one of the great dragons of the region, fell to the rot. Grail, the enormous elder dragon, lay in the dragon barrow, too large to flee, waiting for someone to end her misery. The rot had touched even beings of draconic power. Radahn's surviving soldiers stayed. The Redmane knights had burned their crests and sworn to remain, using fire to try to hold the rot back, developing what techniques they could to slow its advance, fighting the specific enemy that their lord could no longer lead them against. It was a losing battle. Caelid fell to the rot, inch by inch, and the Redmane soldiers fought it with fire anyway, because they had made a vow. The swamp of Aeonia. At the exact center of the battle, the specific location where Malenia's bloom had occurred, where the scarlet Aeonia had first expressed itself, the land had become the swamp of Aeonia. a festering bog of scarlet rot, where the ground is liquid and dangerous, where the specific creatures that the rot generates in its most concentrated form inhabit the immediate vicinity of a flower that is still present, the petrified flower. At the center of the swamp, a massive scarlet bloom frozen in stone, the physical remnant of the first scarlet Aeonia, preserved as a landmark in the landscape that the bloom created. The flower that had been the bloom's expression, calcified into a monument to what had happened here. In the swamp's rot-soaked environs, something emerged, not immediately. The specific process by which the outer god of rot generates new life from what it has consumed is not instantaneous. But in the months or years following the bloom, from the swamp's specific concentration of divine rot, from the scarlet Aeonia's specific residue, children appeared, Millicent and her sisters. They emerged from the swamp as infants, or as something resembling infants. The specific mechanism by which Malenia's bloom generated offspring is one of the law's most carefully sustained ambiguities. The game calls them buds, offshoots of the great bloom, the scarlet Aeonia, expressing itself not just in the transformation of the landscape, but in the specific generation of humanoid life that bore the bloom's nature. 5 of them, Millicent and 4 sisters, Mary the eldest, Maureen the second, Amy the third, Pollyanna the youngest, each bearing Malenia's characteristics in ways that go beyond simple biological resemblance, each carrying the waterfowl dance in their muscle memory, the specific combat style that Malenia had developed through a lifetime of fighting with her condition, each missing the same arm, the right arm, the same arm that Malenia had lost to the rot, replicated in the offspring that the bloom had generated as if the pattern of the original was written into the copies. Sage Gowry found them in the swamp, a figure who is not what he initially appears to be, a wise old scholar at a roadside shack, willing to help a Tarnished with a puzzle of Celia's sealed towers in exchange for assistance. What he actually is, a kindred of rot, one of the insect-like creatures that worship the rot as divine, capable of inhabiting a human-appearing form, devoted to the specific vision of an age of rot that Malenia's ascension to full godhood would usher in. He raised the 5 sisters as his daughters, not from affection, from calculation. He was a devotee of the Order of Rot, the cult that had formed around the specific theology of Malenia's eventual blooming. When Malenia ascends to godhood, Gowry believed, the daughters of the bloom would be reborn as Scarlet Valkyries, the divine warriors that would serve the goddess of Rot in her new age. He sent the 4 elder sisters to the Haligtree, kept Millicent in Caelid, in the Church of the Plague, where the specific concentration of rot worshippers gave her a kind of congregation that treated her as a sacred presence, because they recognized in her what she was, even if she did not yet recognize it herself. Millicent's journey. When the Tarnished encounters Millicent at the Church of the Plague, she is huddled against a stone wall, the rot advancing through her body, her right arm already gone. She does not know who she is. The rot that afflicts her has damaged her memory. The specific price of carrying the outer god's essence at close range without the protection that Miquella's needle had given Malenia. She knows she is dying from something she did not choose to be born with. The unalloyed gold needle recovered from Commander O'Neill, who had been carrying it toward Malenia before the battle and had not made it. is brought to her by the Tarnished. She inserts it. The rot stalls. Her mind clears enough for her to begin understanding what she is. She travels, retracing the route that Malenia had taken on the march south, but in reverse, moving toward the Haligtree rather than away from it, through the Altus Plateau, where the Tarnished encounters her again, up to the mountaintops of the giants, into the Haligtree itself, where her sisters had already arrived, and where Malenia sleeps in Elfale, waiting for a challenger. She does not know exactly what she is looking for. She describes it as returning something to Malenia, returning the will that was once her own, the specific quality of individual selfhood that Malenia had spent her life maintaining against the rot's claim. Millicent, who had the rot inside her and was learning to live with it rather than simply succumb, understood something about Malenia that the battle's outcome had obscured, that the choice between being yourself and being the rot's instrument was one that Malenia had made every day of her life. Gowry's betrayal and what it meant. At the Haligtree, after Millicent has reached the end of her journey, Gowry's true design becomes clear. He wants Millicent to die, not simply to die, but to die through betrayal. A bud that is betrayed by someone it trusted will bloom in the most complete way, Gowry believes, producing the most perfect Scarlet Valkyrie when Malenia's ascension eventually occurs. He is asking the Tarnished to be that betrayal, to turn on Millicent after accompanying her across half the lands between. What happens to Millicent if the Tarnished helps her instead? She survives the attack by her sisters. She finds the Tarnished one more time, dying beside a pool of poison, having removed the unalloyed gold needle from her own body. She did this deliberately, not because the rot overwhelmed her, because she chose to die as herself, rather than continue living as something that was heading toward being only what the rot intended. If I am to flower into something other than myself, she says, I would rather rot into nothingness as I am. This is the specific statement that Millicent's questline was building toward. The same choice Malenia has been making her entire life, expressed by her daughter in simpler terms at the moment of her death. The rot offers transformation. The transformation requires giving up who you currently are. Some people find that acceptable. Millicent does not. She dies as herself. The outer god does not get what he was working toward in her. The order of rot and what it believes. Sage Gowry was not alone in his devotion to the specific theology that Malenia's existence had generated. Throughout Caelid, among the populations that the rot had touched and the creatures that the rot had spawned, a religious tradition had formed around the specific promise of what the rot offered. The order of rot, the specific belief that the rot cycle of decay and rebirth was not simply a natural process or a catastrophe, but a divine design, that the outer god of rot was a legitimate divinity worthy of worship, that Malenia was its avatar and eventual goddess, that the world that would emerge from the rot's consuming transformation was worth the cost of what it consumed. Malay Murray, a minor figure in the Shaded Castle, considered Malenia his personal goddess. The kindred of rot, the insect-like creatures that the rot generates from corrupted humans, organize themselves around the specific relationship to the divine that Gowry represented at a more sophisticated level. The specific theological argument the Order of Rot makes. The rot is not ending things, it is changing them. What looks like destruction is actually the precondition for something new. The landscapes that the rot transforms are not dead. They are different, filled with the specific life that the outer god of rot cultivates, rather than the life that existed before. Whether this is correct, whether the age of rot that Gowry was hoping for would actually have been something worth desiring, the lore does not answer directly. The outer god of rot is presented as a genuine divine entity, with a genuine perspective on existence. Whether that perspective is right is left as the question that the Tarnished's choice about Millicent implicitly asks them to answer. What the bloom left in the Haligtree, Malenia's return to the Haligtree, was not only a return of the sleeping demigod, it was a return of the rot she had released. Her presence in the Haligtree, still carrying the outer god's mark on her body, now more fully than before the bloom, began to affect the tree itself. Miquella's Haligtree, the sacred tree grown from an Empyrean's blood, designed to operate outside the greater will's authority, was corrupted. The specific sacred space that had been intended as a sanctuary for those the Golden Order excluded became a space saturated with the rot that Malenia now carried more fully than she had before Aeonia. The mushrooms and flowers of Scarlet Rot grew through the Haligtree's architecture. The warriors who remained to guard Malenia, the Clean Rot Knights who had survived, those who came after, fought a war on two fronts. The external threat of anyone who would disturb their sleeping commander, and the internal threat of the rot that their sleeping commander was slowly filling their sanctuary with. They endured it because she was still Malenia, still the blade of Miquella, still the warrior who had never known defeat. Whatever the rot was doing to the tree, it was doing because she was present, and her presence was what they were there to protect. Sleep well. 5 more parts remain, and the Haligtree is waiting. Clean Rot Knight Finlay carried Malenia back to the Haligtree. The journey from the swamp of Aeonia to the far north of the lands between, alone, carrying a sleeping demigod through territory that had been transformed by the rot the sleeping demigod had released. This is one of the most quietly extraordinary things in all of Elden Ring's lore. Not extraordinary because of its magic or its divine significance. Extraordinary because of the specific quality of loyalty that it represents. One soldier. The rest of her army was dead or scattered. She'd survived something that had killed thousands, and she carried her commander home. Finlay placed Malenia at the roots of the Haligtree, and Malenia slept. What the Haligtree was before the rot. Miquella had been building the Haligtree since before the Shattering. The tree had been grown from a sapling watered with his own Empyrean blood. The specific investment of divine material that made it more than an ordinary tree, that gave it the specific relationship to the divine that only Empyrean blood could establish. The Haligtree was not simply a tree. It was the physical expression of Miquella's rejection of the Golden Order's framework, the specific recognition that the system his mother had built could not help his sister, could not help the people it excluded, and needed to be replaced by something organized around different principles. A tree that operated outside the greater will's authority, that could bless what the Erdtree would not bless. The people who came to the Haligtree were the people the Golden Order had no room for. The Albinaurics, the artificial humanoid beings created by human craftsmen, denied grace by the Golden Order, cursed to a progressive physical decline. Loretta found them and brought them to the Haligtree, having journeyed from her post as a Caelid knight in service to the Caelid royal family, specifically to search for a safe haven for a people who had none. The misbegotten, beings who were considered impure by the Golden Order's standards, whose existence was treated as an aberration rather than a form of life with its own validity. They came to the Haligtree because Miquella's blessing explicitly included what Marika's blessing excluded: the kindred of rot, the insect-like creatures that the rot generated, that Gowry was a more sophisticated example of. They came because the Haligtree, increasingly saturated with the rot that Malenia's sleeping body was releasing into the tree, felt like a place that welcomed what the rot had made of them. It was a sanctuary, imperfect, dangerous in its own way, increasingly affected by the specific environmental changes that Malenia's presence was producing, but a sanctuary nonetheless, a place where the unwanted came and were not immediately driven out. Miquella's absence. Before Malenia arrived at the Haligtree, before the Battle of Aeonia, while Malenia was still marching south, Miquella had done something extraordinary. He had embedded himself within the Haligtree itself. He wove a cocoon. He placed himself inside the tree's trunk, within the cocoon, his Empryan blood flowing directly into the tree, rather than simply watering it from outside. The specific purpose: to accelerate the tree's growth through direct divine infusion, to push it past the limits that external watering had reached, to try to make it become what he needed it to be, something that rivaled the Erd tree, that could provide the divine alternative that the unalloyed Gold Order required. The tree was not growing fast enough. Blood alone was not sufficient. He needed to be inside it. He was inside it when Mog found him. Mog, Lord of Blood, who was himself charmed by Miquella, who believed he was acting of his own will when he carved the young demigod out of the tree, arrived at the Haligtree while Malenia was away fighting Radahn. He took Miquella. He took the cocoon, Miquella still inside it, still sleeping. He brought it to Mogwyn Palace, his hidden realm of blood and shadow, and began drenching it in blood flame, trying to accelerate Miquella's ascension to godhood through his patron-specific methods. The Haligtree, without Miquella's direct infusion, began to wither. The specific process of growth that his presence inside the trunk had been driving, deprived of its source, deprived of the Empyrean blood flowing through its structure, reversed. The tree did not die immediately, but it stopped growing in the direction Miquella had intended. When Malenia arrived at the withering Haligtree, placed at its roots by Finlay, beginning her long sleep, she was placed in a tree that was already declining from the absence of the brother she was waiting for, and her presence, as she slept, added its own specific pressure to the decline, the rot seeping from her body into the roots, spreading upward through the structure, transforming what Miquella had built into something increasingly saturated with the outer god's nature. What the rot did to the Haligtree, slowly, not catastrophically, not the way that Caelid had been transformed in a single moment of bloom. The rot spread through the Haligtree was the gradual process that the rot normally follows, advancing through proximity, taking hold where it found purchase, transforming what it touched into something different from what it had been. The specific visual language of the Haligtree's upper areas and Elphael's lower sections tells this story without a single line of dialogue. The upper areas, Haligtree Town, are relatively intact. The architecture Miquella had built for the unwanted still recognizable as something that is designed to be welcoming. The lower sections descend through increasing rot saturation. The stone of Elphael's fortifications increasingly covered with the scarlet fungi and flowers that the outer god cultivates wherever it takes hold. By the time the Tarnished reaches the Haligtree roots at the very base of the structure, where Malenia sleeps, the environment is thoroughly transformed, the rot's presence at its most concentrated. The Clean Rot Knights who remained fought this on two fronts. They protected the perimeter, keeping out intruders who might disturb Malenia's sleep, maintaining the specific mission of guard duty that their entire military tradition had been built around. And they endured the rot that their commander's presence was spreading through the tree they were defending. The Clean Rot Knights had always known this was possible. Their name acknowledged it. They had vowed to fight alongside Malenia despite the inevitable gradual putrefaction of their flesh. The specific acceptance of what fighting beside the blade of Miquella meant. The rot would come for them eventually, not as an attack from outside, but as a consequence of proximity to the divine curse their commander carried, had always been part of the oath. They stayed, they fought. The rot advanced through the tree anyway. Loretta and the mission she would not abandon. Knight Loretta had been a Carian royal knight, a servant of the royal family of Caria, the lineage of Renala and Rani and Radahn in their maternal line. When she left Caria, she left in search of something, a safe haven for the Albinorics, a people who were dying, whose progressive physical decline left successive generations increasingly unable to walk, who needed somewhere that would take them before they faded entirely. She found the Haligtree. She considered it the Albinoric's best chance for salvation. She replaced the glintstone in her war sickle's hilt, the blue glintstone of Carian scholarship that had been her weapon's feature since she was given it as a personal guard of the royal family, with the stone of unalloyed gold, Miquella's metal, her new allegiance made physical. She established the Albinoric sanctuary in the Haligtree's boughs and stayed to guard it. When Miquella was taken and the tree began to wither, when Malenia arrived and the rot began its slow advance, Loretta stayed. She was guarding what she had brought here. She was honoring the mission that had been the point of everything she had done since leaving Caria. When the Tarnished encounters her at the bottom of Miquella's Haligtree, she fights to prevent them from descending to Elphael. She is protecting what she has always been protecting. The people who came here because they had nowhere else to go. The sleeping commander in the roots below. The specific promise that the Haligtree had represented before everything began to go wrong. She fights with her full capability. She loses. And the path to Elphael opens. The dream that held Malenia. While Malenia slept, she dreamed. The lore suggests through the connection between Miquella and his other half-saint Trina, whose specific domain is sleep and the specific quality of rest she generates, that Miquella may have put Malenia to sleep deliberately, not the biological consequence of the bloom's cost on her body. A specific sleep induced by the dreaming aspect of the twin she was waiting for, extended across the years of her absence because something about the specific quality of St. Trina's sleep kept Malenia in it beyond what her body required for recovery. Whether this was mercy, preserving Malenia from the grief of waking to find Miquella gone, taken while she was at the battle his plan required her to fight, or simply the consequence of a divine twin's influence persisting even after separation, is not resolved. She dreamed for a long time. Her own words, when the Tarnished wakes her. I dreamt for so long. My flesh was dull gold, and my blood rotted. Corpse after corpse left in my wake, as I awaited his return. She dreamed of what she had done, of the bodies, of waiting, the specific quality of a consciousness preserved in sleep that is not simple unconsciousness, aware enough to process the weight of what the waking world had cost, not awake enough to act on it. She was waiting for Miquella. He was not coming. The Haligtree on the day the Tarnished arrives. The Tarnished who reaches Miquella's Haligtree finds a place that is simultaneously what Miquella built and what time and rot and Malenia's sleeping presence have made of it. The sanctuary is still functioning. The Albinorics are still here. The misbegotten are still here. The kindred of rot who worship what Malenia represents are still here. The tree that was supposed to rival the Erd tree, that was supposed to provide the divine alternative that the Golden Order's excluded people needed, is withering. But it is still standing. The Clean Rot Knights are still at their posts. Finley's ashes are in a specific location within Elfale, still being guarded by another Clean Rot Knight. The specific testimony of someone who carried a sleeping demigod home alone, preserved in the game's environmental storytelling as a record of what devotion actually looks like. And at the roots, Malenia sleeps. The Tarnished descends through the progressively more rot-saturated architecture of Elfale, past the warriors who've been holding this position since before the Tarnished left their burial ground, to the fog door at the Haligtree roots. She wakes when they arrive. She is not angry that they have come. She perceives the Tarnished as something that has arrived from outside, a challenge to the space she has been holding, and she responds to challenges in the only language she has ever spoken fluently. She introduces herself, not as a demigod or a daughter of Marika, or even as Malenia the Severed, the title given by the Shattering's loss of her limbs, as the blade of Miquella, as the warrior who has never known defeat. The fight begins. Sleep well. 4 more parts remain, and what the fight reveals has not yet been said. The fog door opens. The chamber beyond is a large space with a shallow pool of water at its center. Clean water, the specific contrast of something clear and still in an environment that has been increasingly saturated with rot. Malenia stands in this chamber, her back to the Tarnished, her posture the specific posture of someone who has been waiting. Not impatient, not restless, simply present in the way that a warrior who has spent a lifetime waiting for worthy challenges learns to be present. She does not turn immediately. She speaks first. What she says, the introduction she gives herself is precise. She is Malenia, Blade of Miquella, and she has never known defeat. The statement is not a boast in the conventional sense. It is a statement of fact that functions simultaneously as warning and as context. She is telling the Tarnished something true and something important. Something that the fight they are about to enter will test in a specific way. She has never known defeat. This is technically accurate and also incomplete in the specific way that the most devastating moments of Elden Ring's lore tend to be. The Battle of Aeonia was a stalemate, not a defeat. Radahn was not defeated by Malenia's martial skill. He was defeated by the bloom, by the release of the outer god's power, by the specific circumstance that Malenia had spent her entire life trying never to need. To use the bloom against an equal opponent was not the same as defeating them through the waterfowl dance, through the art that she had developed precisely to avoid being the outer god's instrument. She has never known defeat in the conventional warrior's sense. She has known the bloom. These are different things. The distinction matters to her in a way that the lore implies she had been processing across all the years of sleep in the Haligtree roots. The first phase, she charges immediately after the introduction. The waterfowl dance, the combination of flowing movements that she developed through a lifetime of fighting with prosthetic limbs, with rotting eyes, with a body constantly contested by something that wanted it, is the opening statement of what she is. The mechanics of fighting Malenia are among the most demanding in all of From Software's catalogue. She is faster than expected. Her damage is extreme. Her range, combined with the flowing nature of her movements, makes conventional defensive postures inadequate in ways that other bosses do not achieve. But the specific mechanic that defines her above all others is the one tied directly to her lore. She heals from every hit she lands, not from critical hits, from every successful strike, blocked or unblocked, significant or grazing. The specific property of Malenia's combat is that attacking her, even from behind a shield, feeds her. The Rot's relationship to her body has been inverted in this specific way. She does not drain from being damaged. She replenishes from damaging. In lore terms, this is the expression of the outer god's blessing on its avatar, a divine force that specializes in consuming what it touches, directed through Malenia's body, making every engagement a transaction where her opponent's defense costs them more than they receive in return. She cannot be worn down the way other opponents can be worn down. She must be defeated at speed, with commitment, in ways that do not give her enough successful attacks to undo the damage being done to her. This is the specific logic of someone who was never meant to be fought defensively. Malenia's entire martial tradition was built around continuous movement, around refusing to be static, around the waterfall dance that gives no moment of stillness that an opponent could use. The mechanic reflects this. Standing still in front of Malenia, blocking, waiting, is not a viable approach. The fight requires the Tarnished to adopt something of her own logic. Continuous motion, constant pressure, the refusal to stop moving. The second phase. When the first phase is over, when Malenia's health reaches zero, a cutscene plays. She falls, and then the Scarlet Aeonia blooms again, the second bloom, the outer god's expression through its avatar for the second time, the specific release of what has been building since the first bloom in Caelid. Wings made of her hair and rot-infused butterflies emerge from the bloom. The chamber fills with the specific quality of a space that has been touched by a divine entity's direct expression. She rises with 80% of her maximum health restored. Not fully. The bloom has a cost. always has a cost, but significantly. The second phase. Malenia is not the Malenia who had been worn down to zero. She is something that has been renewed by the outer god's power, something that has accepted what the bloom means more fully than she accepted it at Aeonia. Her name changes. The game tracks this specifically, where the first phase called her Malenia, Blade of Miquella. The second phase calls her Malenia, Goddess of Rot. The specific significance of this distinction is one of the most debated questions in the Elden Ring community. The Scarlet Aeonia incantation's description states that each time the scarlet flower blooms, Malenia's rot advances, and that with the third bloom, she will become a true goddess. The fight with the Tarnished is her second bloom. The name change to Goddess of Rot has been read as evidence that this second bloom was enough, that in the moment of the fight, she ascended to the full expression of what the outer god intended for her. Whether the Tarnished fights a demigod in the second phase, or a nascent goddess, is left open by the lore in the specific way that Elden Ring's most important questions are left open. What she is fighting for. The Tarnished is not a personal enemy. The lore does not suggest that Malenia has any grievance against them specifically. She has been asleep. She has been waiting for Miquella. She had no opportunity to develop any particular relationship to the figure who arrives at the Haligtree roots. She fights because the Tarnished is a challenge, and challenges are what she has always engaged with, and because what she is protecting, the space where she sleeps, the Haligtree she has corrupted with her presence, the brother she is waiting for, is threatened by any arrival at the fog door. But there is something else in the fight that the cutscene between phases implies. The bloom happens when she falls, not as a choice, in the obvious way, but as the body's response to apparent defeat. The outer god seizes what it has always been waiting to seize, the moment of surrender, the moment when Malenia's pride and will have been brought to the point where the bloom becomes available. This is what happened at Caelid. This is what happened in the Tarnished's fight. Both times, the bloom required Malenia to be in a position where her conventional defenses had been overcome, where the specific dignity that had kept the outer god's full expression at bay had been temporarily broken. The bloom is not a power-up in the conventional sense. It is the outer god claiming what it has always had access to, when the person guarding against it is no longer able to maintain that guard. Malenia wins the bloom. She does not choose the bloom any more than she chose it in Caelid. She endures it. The healing that should not be possible. The mechanic of Malenia healing from every hit is not simply a game-balanced decision. It is one of the most precisely lore-accurate mechanics in Elden Ring's entire design. The outer god of Rot does not produce simple disease. Its relationship to the life processes of the beings it inhabits is more complex than parasitism. It sustains as well as transforms. What it takes from the world through its avatar, it also returns to the avatar, making Malenia's body a site of ongoing divine transaction, rather than simply a vessel being slowly consumed. The specific quality of a warrior who drains her opponents by fighting them is the physical expression of the outer god's nature channeled through her combat. Not deliberately, Malenia did not design this property of her fighting. It is what the Rot, over a lifetime of integration with her body, has made her capable of. The most disturbing implication This means that every victory Malenia has ever won, every opponent she has ever defeated, the specific quality of her never having known defeat includes this mechanism. She did not win by being the better fighter, in the simple sense. She won by being the fighter whose divine curse provided a specific advantage against opponents who did not share it. The greatest warrior in the lands between is the greatest warrior partly because the outer god of Rot, living inside her, feeds her as she fights. She knows this, and she fights anyway. She has never known defeat, partly because of this, and she does not disown the victories that the Rot made possible. They are hers. The blade does not apologize for its edge, what it costs. Each bloom advances the Rot. The Scarlet Ionia's description is explicit. Each time the flower blooms, Malenia's Rot advances. The second bloom, the one that occurs in the fight with the Tarnished, has pushed what was already extensive to something further. The body that stood against Radahn and survived was already compromised beyond what Miquella's needle alone could have addressed. The body that blooms a second time in Elfale is a body that has given more of itself to the outer god's expression than it had before. The third bloom would make her a true goddess. This means the fight the Tarnished wins is not a victory over someone who was holding back. Malenia, in the second phase, after the bloom, is the most complete expression of what she is, the most fully realized version of the blade of Miquella, using everything the outer god's advance has given her, fighting with the specific tools of a lifetime compressed into this single encounter. The Tarnished defeats her at her most complete expression. The last words. When Malenia dies, she speaks. The law preserves her last words, spoken not to the Tarnished who killed her, but to her brother. She calls for Miquella. She asks him to carry her. The specific words vary in translation, but the consistent call. A dying warrior calling for the person she fought for, the person she was waiting for, the person who is not there. Miquella is not there. He is in the land of shadow, having shed his flesh and his love, and his other half on the road to the gate of divinity, having discarded what she represented to him in service of the plan that her battle with Radahn had been built to advance. She does not know this. She calls for him anyway. The outer god of Rot lost its most complete vessel. The third bloom did not come. The true goddess the Order of Rot was waiting for did not emerge. And in the Haligtree's root chamber, after the fight, a flower remains. The Scarlet Aeonia, solid, petrified, the physical remnant of the second bloom. Still there, still carrying the specific quality of what Malenia was. If the Tarnished has completed Millicent's questline and carries the unalloyed gold needle, they can give it to the flower. What they receive, Miquella's needle, and a somber ancient dragon smithing stone. The needle that Miquella made for his sister, recovered from the flower she left behind, given to the Tarnished as the specific tool that can disrupt an outer god's claim on a vessel. The needle that protected Malenia for a lifetime returns to the world after her death. In the hands of whoever carries it, it can prevent another outer god's claim from completing, specifically the frenzied flame that can claim the Tarnished who accepts the Three Fingers gift, Malenia's protection, extended past her death, through an object, to a person she never met, about a threat she never encountered. She has never known defeat, and she is gone, and the needle continues its purpose. Sleep well. 3 more parts remain, and the rot is not finished yet. We have followed Malenia from the sealed god beneath the Ainsel River, to the bloom in Caelid, to the sleep in the Haligtree, to the fight at the roots. We have followed the rot from its ancient imprisonment through its avatar's lifetime of resistance to the second bloom that ended in Elphael's root chamber. But there is a relationship at the center of the story that has not yet been given its full attention. Not the relationship between Malenia and Miquella, though that is the organizing devotion of her entire existence. The relationship between Malenia and Radahn, the 2 greatest warriors of the Shattering, the half-siblings who found each other as equals on a battlefield in Caelid, and whose encounter changed the world permanently. Tonight we look at what the 2 of them actually were to each other, and at the specific details of the Battle of Aeonia that the DLC's Revelations completed. Half-siblings, different traditions. Malenia and Radahn shared a father. Radahn, who was also Marika, who had been both of them in the specific impossible way that Elden Ring's divine parentage works, but they were raised in entirely different contexts. Malenia with Miquella in the Haligtree's development and in the specific culture of 2 cursed twins who had only each other as reliable companions. Radahn with Renala's children in Leonia, in the tradition of Carian scholarship and gravitational sorcery, and the specific military culture of a demigod who idolized Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, and wanted to be what Godfrey had been. They were half-siblings who never shared a childhood, whose paths crossed only in the context of the Shattering's wars. What they knew of each other before Caelid was reputation, not relationship. Radahn's reputation, the strongest demigod, the one who had stopped the stars, the Red Lion whose red-maned knights were among the most feared military force in the lands between. A warrior who fought in the tradition of pure martial excellence, overwhelming force, gravitational power, the specific quality of someone who had made themselves into the most physically capable fighter they could be, and then used that capability in service of the people who followed them. Malenia's reputation, undefeated. The blade of Miquella, who had humbled Godric without apparent difficulty, whose clean-rot knights had won every battle they entered, who carried a curse that should have limited her, and had instead made her what she was. Neither had met their equal. Until Caelid, what the duel actually was. The accounts available in the game's lore document the Battle of Aeonia as a stalemate. 2 demigods of equal capability who fought to a standstill until the bloom resolved the impasse. But the DLC's revelation about what Malenia whispered to Radahn before the bloom changes what the stalemate meant. She whispered, "Miquella awaits thee, O promised consort." The vow between Miquella and Radahn, the childhood promise that Radahn had accepted, that the strongest and kindest of Miquella's brothers would become his consort when the Empyrean achieved godhood, meant that Radahn's death at Aeonia was not simply a casualty of the Shattering's wars. It was the first step of Miquella's plan. Malenia knew this. She came to Caelid knowing what her victory needed to produce. Not Radahn defeated in the conventional military sense, but Radahn dead, or more precisely, Radahn in the state where his soul would be available to make the journey to the land of shadow. The bloom, which left him feral and mindless but still alive, was not the intended outcome. but the subsequent killing of Radahn by the Tarnished, which freed the stars and allowed Rani's plan to proceed, and also, by Miquella's specific design, freed Radhahn's soul, completed what the Battle of Aeonia had begun. The bloom was the mechanism by which a warrior who could not defeat another warrior by conventional means ensured the outcome that Miquella's plan required. Whether Malenia chose to break the needle in that specific moment, whether the bloom was a decision rather than a collapse, is the question that the duel's ambiguity is organized around. The lore supports both readings. Both have consequences for what the duel was, what Radahn held back. The Battle of Aeonia's records include a detail that is easy to miss. Radahn's eventual defeat in the Radahn festival reveals that he had been holding back against Malenia all along. What this means, the duel that ended in a stalemate, that both parties fought to the limits of their capability, was a duel in which only Malenia fought at full capacity. Radahn restrained himself. The specific reason the law implies, whether it was the terms of the vow with Miquella, whether he understood what Malenia's whisper meant, whether there was something about fighting a sister who had come at Miquella's direction that he could not fully oppose, is not confirmed. But the record exists. The warrior who held the stars in place, who was feared as the strongest demigod of the Shattering, who defeated the other demigods in the wars that preceded Caelid, did not fight Malenia with everything he had. The stalemate that ended in the bloom was not two equals. It was Malenia at her limit against Radahn, at less than his. Whether Malenia knew this during the fight, and what knowing it would have meant for how she experienced the battle, the lore does not say. What she said before the bloom was Miquella awaits thee. What the bloom did was ensure that Radahn would eventually reach the destination those words described. The duel was the means of a plan. Whether Radahn understood himself to be serving the plan by holding back, whether his restraint was his own form of honoring the vow, is one of the specific questions the DLC allows and does not resolve. What Radahn's soldiers did afterward, after the bloom and the battle's end, Radahn's Redmane Knights remained on the field, not because they did not know the battle was over, but because the oath they carried made leaving impossible. The Redmane Knights burned the crest from the left breast of their armor, the red lion symbol, Radahn's heraldry, the sign of their service to the general, seared away as an act of resolve. They would stay. They were not going home. The vow they made among themselves, to be a bulwark against the encroaching Scarlet Rot, to use fire to hold back what the bloom had released, to ensure that the Rot did not advance beyond Caelid into the wider lands between. This is one of the Shattering's most quietly heroic things, an army without a commander, whose commander had been reduced to a feral creature wandering the battlefield, consuming everything he could reach, burning their own insignia, and choosing to remain in the most hostile environment in the lands between, because someone had to hold the line. They could not win. The Rot continued to advance regardless of their fire. Caelid fell to what Malenia had released, inch by inch, and the Redmane Knights burned it back and watched it return. The specific futility of the campaign they had chosen is visible everywhere in Caelid. The soldiers using fire against a divine force, the fire slowing but not stopping what an outer god had set in motion. They stayed anyway, not because staying would work, because someone had to stay. Radahn's deepest grudge of all the Shattering, according to records, was against Malenia. Whether this was the grudge of a warrior who had been defeated by means he had not fully resisted, who had held back and watched the bloom consume the battlefield he had restrained himself from defending fully, is not confirmed. But the grudge existed. The warrior who had loved his horse and stopped the stars and held back against his half-sister in a battle that cost him his mind, carried that grudge even in the feral state that the rot had produced. The Radahn Festival. Castellan had been Radahn's friend since his time at Caria, a guest general who had served alongside him, who had made a vow with the demigod, the vow of honourable death, if one of them fell in battle in a way that left them dishonoured, consumed, lost, reduced to something that could not represent what they had been. The other would give them the warrior's death that restored the honour. Radahn could not die by conventional means. His great rune sustained him. The rot consumed his mind, but not his body, and the specific combination of divine resilience and the great rune's burning resistance kept him alive in the wasteland of the Wailing Dunes, wandering, feral, howling at the sky. Jeren organized the Radahn Festival, a gathering of warriors from across the lands between, summoned by the alignment of the stars that Radahn was still holding in place, invited to kill the demigod who could not die by conventional means, not as conquest, as mercy, as the fulfillment of the vow Jeren had made. The Radahn Festival was an act of love, a friend organizing the death of someone he cared about because it was the best thing left to give them. The warriors who participated were not simply testing themselves against a famous opponent. They were helping Jeren keep a promise. The Tarnished killed Radahn at the festival. The stars were freed. Ranni's plan proceeded. And Radahn's soul, the soul that Malenia had whispered toward the land of shadow before the bloom, began the journey that Miquella had designed. The Redmane Knights, who had stayed in Caelid, using fire against the advancing rot. When the stars moved again, they knew that their general had finally received the honourable end that Jeren had promised. Whether this brought them comfort in the specific environment they had chosen to die in is not recorded. What the two greatest warriors represent, Malenia and Radahn, are the Shattering's central tragedy. Two warriors of extraordinary capability who found each other as equals. Perhaps the only two beings in the lands between who could have served as equals for each other. In a battle that was not about them finding each other, but about Miquella's plan, reaching the stage where Radahn's death was required. Radahn had made a vow with Miquella. He had chosen the role of future consort in a childhood arrangement whose specific emotional weight. Whether he genuinely wanted this, whether he understood what being Miquella's consort would mean, whether the charm that Miquella could exercise over those he chose was already present in that earliest conversation, is left open by the DLC's flashback. Malenia had devoted her entire life to being Miquella's blade. Every battle she won, every opponent she defeated, every year of fighting the rot that lived inside her, all of it in service of the twin who was trying to free them both from what they had been born into. They met on a field in Caelid as instruments of the same plan, Radahn serving it by accepting the vow, Malenia serving it by coming to enforce the vow's terms. Neither chose the encounter freely in the sense that it was organized entirely around Miquella's design, rather than their own desires. The greatest warriors in the lands between were used as pieces in a plan. The bloom that ended their battle left Caelid a wasteland, left Radahn feral, left Malenia in a coma, carried home by the last surviving member of her army. They were equals. The plan did not need them as equals. The plan needed the outcome. The specific grief of the Battle of Aeonia is that the two most extraordinary warriors of their generation found each other and could not simply fight, could not exist in that moment of genuine equality without the whole weight of Miquella's architecture bearing down on what they were to each other. Sleep well. 2 more parts remain, and the story has not yet said everything it wants to say. The relationship between Malenia and Miquella is the organizing center of everything we have followed. Every choice she made, every battle, every march, the bloom itself, was made in his name, in service of his purposes, out of the specific love that twin prodigies cursed from birth develop for each other when they have been each other's most reliable constant since the day they arrived in the world. Tonight we look at this relationship directly, at what it was, at what Miquella did with it, at what it cost Malenia, not just in battle, but in the specific way that love costs the person who loves most completely. Born together into cursed existence, they were born at the same moment into the same condition, cursed, Empyrean, belonging to a god who was also their father. The specifics of their curses were different, Miquella's eternal youth, Malenia's rot, but the experience of waking into a body that was already wrong, that already required management and resistance from the first breath, was something they shared. The Golden Order, which was their mother's project, could not help either of them. The 2 fingers that administered the Tree's divine authority had identified both of them as Empyrean candidates, as potential successors to Marika's role as the god of the next age. But the specific afflictions they carried were not ones that the Golden Order's framework of grace could address. The rot was an outer god's claim, operating outside and against the greater will's authority. The eternal youth was a similar curse, similarly resistant to what Marika's divine system could offer. They had each other, and they had the intelligence and the Empyrean capability to begin working on what the Golden Order could not fix. Miquella worked. He worked with extraordinary dedication, developing the unalloyed gold and the needles, growing the Haligtree from a sapling watered with his own blood, attempting to find the specific cure that would free them from what they had been born into. He was trying to fix both of them simultaneously, using his capability toward the specific problem of their shared cursed existence. Malenia fought. She had discovered early that the rot's advance could be managed through the specific quality of continuous movement, that the waterfowl dance, in its earliest forms, was how she maintained the space between herself and what was always trying to consume her. She trained, she became what she became, and she protected Miquella, because Miquella was working on the problem they shared, and the problem could only be worked on if Miquella was still alive to work on it. Blade and Scholar, twin prodigies whose specific relationship was also a functional division of labor, one doing what needed to be done with a sword, so that the other could continue doing what needed to be done with knowledge. What Miquella built for her, the unalloyed gold needle, This is the most direct expression of what Miquella's love for his sister looked like in physical form. Not a gift in the conventional sense, a tool designed for a specific purpose that required years of developing the specific properties of an alloyed gold and years of understanding the specific mechanism of the outer god's claim on Malenia's body before it could be made correctly. He made it. He gave it to her. He told her where to press it into her body so that the disruption of the outer god's influence would be as complete as possible. The needle kept the rot from advancing. It could not cure her. It could not remove what had been present since birth. But it gave her the space in which to be herself, to fight with her own will directing her power, to move without the outer god's logic overriding her own, to be Malenia the warrior, rather than simply the rot's avatar. The prosthetic limbs were also his design. The arm and the leg and the foot that the rot had consumed, replaced not simply with functional substitutes, but with unalloyed gold fittings, with a specific material whose properties might slow the rot's advance into the new interfaces between flesh and metal. He could not give her back the limbs she had lost. He could make what replaced them as protective as possible. The Haligtree itself was built partly for her. The specific goal that the unalloyed gold order represented, a divine framework that operated outside the greater will's authority, that could treat conditions the greater will could not treat, was the framework that might eventually produce the cure that the needle was delaying the need for. He was building toward a world where the rot could be addressed rather than simply managed. Everything he built with both of them in mind. She was Blade of Miquella. He was the architect of the possibility that she would not have to be the rot's blade forever. What she did for him. Malenia was Miquella's protector. This is her title and her function, and the specific expression of what the love between them looked like from her side. Every battle she won was won in his defense, not simply the military defense of his physical person, but the defense of the time and space he needed to do what he was doing. The march south against Radahn was not simply the battle of two demigods in Caelid. It was Miquella's plan, requiring an obstacle removed, and Malenia removing it. She knew, when she marched south, that using the bloom was a possibility. The needle could not last forever. The specific stress of a battle against the most powerful demigod of the Shattering was the kind of stress that the needle might not survive, that she might not be able to maintain the will and the pride that kept the bloom at bay through the full duration of a genuine fight to the limits of her capability. She went anyway, not because she was reckless, because Miquella needed the outcome that Caelid would produce. The risk was real. She accepted it because he needed her to accept it. The bloom happened. She was carried home. She slept for the duration of his absence, waiting for his return, in the tree he had grown from his blood that was withering because he had been taken. The specific asymmetry of this. She lay in the roots of what he built, surrounded by the rot she had released into his tree, waiting for him to come back, is one of the quietest devastations in Elden Ring's lore. She waited in the ruin of his project, having contributed to the ruin by returning to it while carrying the rot that Caelid's bloom had fully released. She did not know Miquella was gone by choice rather than by Mog's abduction. She did not know that the plan she had served required him to eventually abandon the Haligtree entirely, She waited, as she had always waited for him, as she had always done what was required for him, in the specific faith of someone who has never had reason to doubt the person she loves most. The DLC's revelation about what Miquella shed, Shadow of the Erdtree's most quietly devastating contribution to Malenia's story, is a single detail about what Miquella shed on the road to the Gate of Divinity. He shed his flesh, he shed his fears, he shed Saint Trina, his other half, the sleeping aspect of himself, the part that faced differently from the plan-oriented waking Miquella. He shed his love. The cross in the stone coffin fissure says, "I abandon here my love." He left it behind because godhood required him to leave it behind. The god he was becoming could not carry what would make it hesitate. The age of compassion he was trying to build required a god who had removed everything that complicated the building. What he abandoned was not an abstraction. The love he had carried, the love that had driven him to make the needle and the prosthetics and the Haligtree and the unalloyed gold order. This was the love for his sister, for Malenia, who was sleeping in the roots of the tree. He had grown from his blood, waiting for him to come back, having bloomed in Caelid for the plan that he was now carrying forward without the capacity to feel what her waiting cost. Saint Trina carries it for him. In the stone coffin fissure, the sleeping aspect of Miquella waits with the animals that followed her into the dark. The part of him that loved Malenia, that grieved for what the bloom had cost her, that wanted something different for the twin who had devoted herself entirely to him, is there, not gone, set aside. Miquella shed his love and continued toward the gate. The god that walked through the gate of divinity did not carry what would have given him pause. Malenia was sleeping in the Halitree's roots, having given everything she had to the plan. Miquella was walking toward godhood, having left behind the capacity to feel what that everything had meant. The most complete expression of devotion. The specific tragedy of Malenia's story is not that she lost. She did not lose, in the conventional sense. She was never defeated by an opponent who overcame her. She died in the Haligtree, woken from her sleep by the Tarnished, fighting in defense of the space she was waiting in. The tragedy is that the devotion was entire, and the object of the devotion had moved past the point of receiving it. Miquella shed his love at a cross on the road to the Gate of Divinity. By the time Malenia called his name with her last breath, the person she was calling for had already ceased to be the person who could hear it. The god that walked through the gate was not the brother who had made the needle for her. The plan that the blade had served had been completed without the blade being told that the service was over. She died calling for someone who was no longer there in the way she needed him to be. Not because he was dead, because he had become something that had moved past the specific capacity for the love she was calling toward. The blade of Miquella died still being the blade of Miquella. The Miquella she was the blade of, the twin who had made the needle and the prosthetics and devoted decades to finding a cure for what they had both been born with, had shed that identity on a road in the land of shadow before she even woke. What she called out to was a cross in a fissure, where Saint Trina waits with sleeping animals in a garden of purple flowers. The love that was abandoned rather than lost, present in its own way, in the specific form of something that was set aside rather than destroyed. She called. The love was there. the person was not. Sleep well. One final part remains, and the rot is still patient. Let everything slow. We have followed Malenia from the ancient god sealed beneath the Ainsel River, to the sleeping girl in the Haligtree's roots, to the second bloom in Elfhel's chamber, to the last words called toward a brother who had already moved past the capacity to receive them. Now we step back and we look at what the story was doing. The question the story has been asking. From the moment Malenia was born carrying the outer god's claim on her body, the story of her life has been organized around a single question that it never answers directly. Is she the rot, or is she herself? The outer god was inside her from birth. Its logic, the cycle of decay and rebirth, the consuming transformation that the rot represents, was present in her body before she had the capacity to resist or accept it. She did not choose this. She did not choose the affliction that consumed her eyes and her limbs. She did not choose to be the avatar that the outer god of rot was working through over the course of her entire existence. What she chose, to resist. Every day of her life with the needle and the will and the pride that the law documents across every item, description, and NPC interaction that touches her character. She chose to be Malenia rather than simply the rot's instrument. This resistance was not complete. The bloom happened, twice. The outer god expressed itself through her in ways that the will and the needle and the pride could not prevent when pushed beyond their limits. Caelid exists because of what she was carrying inside her. The second bloom at Elfhel exists because the Tarnished pushed her to the point where the outer god seized what it had always had access to. She was always both, the rot and herself, the outer god's avatar and the warrior who had built a lifetime of art around refusing to be only that, the bloom and the waterfowl dance, the divine entity that could consume a landscape and the person who sat with Miquella and helped him think through the problems they shared. The story does not resolve this into a simple answer. She was not simply a victim of the outer god. She was not simply its willing instrument. She was the specific, irreducible complexity of a being who carried something she did not choose and built something extraordinary around the refusal to be defined entirely by it. What the waterfowl dance means. The combat style she developed is one of the most precise expressions of character through design in Elden Ring's entire catalogue. Not simply because it is difficult, because what it is communicates something specific about who she is. The waterfowl dance flows. It does not stop. It does not offer the moment of stillness that conventional combat styles produce between strikes. The recovery, the pause, the space where an opponent can reset. It is continuous motion organized around the principle that stopping is what the rot wants, that maintaining the flow is what keeps the rot from taking over, that the body in motion can be itself in a way that the body at rest cannot. She developed this not to be harder to fight. She developed it to survive. The specific quality of continuous movement, the technique that she is famous for, that has killed more Tarnished than any other single mechanic in From Software's history, was her answer to the specific problem of living inside a body that wanted to be still and rot. You keep moving. The rot advances when you stop, so you never stop. This is the waterfowl dance's law, not a sword technique. a philosophy of existence expressed through combat because combat was the arena where the philosophy was most fully tested. What she made of what she was given. The greatest warrior in the lands between. This is not hyperbole. Malenia had never been defeated. Godric grovelled at her feet. Radahn held back against her. The Tarnished who finally bested her did so only after she bloomed twice. After the outer god had expressed itself through her twice. After she had fought with everything the rot gave her, as well as everything she had made of herself. She was made extraordinary by two things that were in tension with each other. The outer god of rot, which gave her the healing in combat and the bloom and the specific divine force that made her more than an ordinary warrior, and the lifetime of resistance to that force, which produced the discipline and the art and the waterfowl dance and the specific quality of someone who had spent their entire existence fighting the most dangerous opponent they would ever face, which was what was inside them. She was greater than she would have been without the rot. This is the specific uncomfortable truth that the law offers. The curse was also, in some precise and terrible sense, a gift. The rot made her what she was by giving her something worth resisting. The warrior who had never known defeat was the warrior who had been fighting the hardest opponent since the day she was born. This does not make the rot a good thing. It does not make the bloom in Caelid acceptable or the destruction of the Haligtree desirable. It is simply true that what Malenia became was shaped by what she had always been fighting, and that fighting shaped her in ways that nothing else could have. What the rot is, the final word. The outer god of rot is not evil in the conventional sense. The law presents it as a genuine divine entity with a genuine perspective on existence, one that values the cycle of decay and rebirth as something more than destruction, that sees the transformation of the world through rot as the precondition for new forms of life that the existing world could not contain. Caelid is wrong. The suffering the bloom caused is real. The specific loss of what that region was before the rot consumed it, the people, the ecosystem, the ordinary life that the rot's transformation ended, is not a small thing. And Caelid also contains the Ionian butterflies and the specific creatures that the rot has generated, and the particular beauty of a landscape that has been shaped by a divine logic other than the Golden Orders. It is not simply ruins. It is the specific expression of what an outer god's presence produces when its full nature is allowed to manifest. The rot is not simply death. It is change into something that serves the outer god's purpose. Whether that purpose is worth the cost of what it consumes is the question that the Order of Rot answers one way, and Millicent's final choice answers another. Malenia spent her life answering it a third way, neither serving the rot fully nor being destroyed by it, carrying it and fighting it simultaneously, using what it gave her while refusing to become only what it wanted her to be. The Scarlet Aeonia in the root chamber. After the fight, in the chamber where Malenia died, a flower remains. The Scarlet Aeonia, the physical remnant of the second bloom, petrified in the spot where she fell, larger than an ordinary flower, carrying the specific quality of something that was both divine expression and personal cost. The bloom that ended a battle and advanced the rot and changed the name that the game tracked her by, all compressed into a single physical object that sits in the chamber after she is gone. The Tarnished who carries Miquella's needle can give it to the flower. This is one of Elden Ring's most quietly precise interactions. The needle made by the twin who loved his sister, pressed into the flower that the sister left behind. When the twin's plan brought her to this point, the needle returns to something of hers. It completes a circuit that the story had left open. What the flower gives back, Miquella's needle itself, and a somber ancient dragon-smithing stone. The needle is restored, no longer the broken version that Commander O'Neill was carrying, but fully functional, and it can be used to remove the frenzied flame's claim on a Tarnished who has accepted the Three Fingers gift. The needle protects against outer gods claiming their vessels. Malenia spent her lifetime carrying it for this reason. It continues this function after her death, in the hands of whoever takes it from her flower, for whatever vessel needs the protection she needed. Her name is Malenia, Blade of Miquella. She has never known defeat. This is all technically accurate, and it is also the specific story of someone who spent her entire life fighting something that was inside her, who built extraordinary art around that fight, who served a brother who eventually shed the capacity to love her as part of the plan she had spent her existence serving, and who died calling his name toward an absence that carried his abandoned love, in a garden of purple flowers at the bottom of a fissure in the land of shadow. What endures? The Haligtree still stands, withering, rot-saturated, no longer growing in the direction Miquella intended, but standing. The Albinorics that Loretta brought here are still here. The misbegotten are still here. The kindred of Rot who worship what Malenia represented are still here. The sanctuary that was built for the unwanted persists, even in its compromised form. The waterfowl dance persists, not in Malenia, she is gone. In Millicent, who died choosing to be herself rather than bloom into what the Rot intended. In her four sisters, who did bloom, who became what Gowry had hoped they would become. In the specific combat tradition of the Daughters of the Bloom, carrying the technique that was not taught to them, but was written into their bodies as an inheritance of what their source had spent a lifetime developing. The needle is in the Tarnished's hands, still doing what it was made to do. The Rot is patient. The outer god beneath the Ainsel River is sealed, not destroyed. Its avatar is gone. The lake of Rot is still red. The swamp of Aeonia is still festering. Caelid has not recovered, and will not recover on any timeline that mortal beings measure. The specific presence of Malenia, the warrior who was both the Rot and herself, who was never only one of those things, is gone from the lands between. What she made and what she protected and what she cost remain. The fight at the Haligtree roots is, in some sense, still happening. Every Tarnished who reaches that fog door and hears her introduce herself encounters the same specific complexity. A being who was cursed from birth and made something extraordinary of the curse, who served with her whole self and was served by something less than whole in return, who asked only to be given the chance to fight on her own terms for the person she loved. She had that. She used it. The waterfowl dance did not stop until it had to. This has been the entire Malenia and Scarlet Rot timeline. From the outer god sealed beneath the Ainsel River, through a lifetime of resistance and a battle in Caelid that changed the world, to the sleep in the Haligtree, and the final fight at its roots, and the last word spoken toward an absence, told slowly, over 8 nights, for the dark between sleep and waking She has never known defeat. She never will. Good night.